The morning light streamed through the expansive glass walls of the bustling airport terminal. Travelers hurried through the polished floors, wheeling their suitcases, clutching passports, and juggling coffee cups. It was a typical day, organized chaos filled with the usual cacophony of announcements and chatter. Among the crowd stood Jason King, a sharply dressed black man in his early 40s. He exuded quiet confidence, his tailored suit a testament to his success. He glanced at his watch, a sleek custom timepiece, and let out a deep breath, as if mentally preparing for the flight ahead. Nearby, Officer Mark Riley stood at his usual post, surveying the crowd with the stern gaze of someone who'd seen too much. A middle-aged white man with a no-nonsense demeanor, Riley was known for his sharp instincts. Years on the force had made him hypervigilant, but also, unbeknownst to him, occasionally too quick to judge. That morning, his attention was drawn to Jason. Something about him seemed, in Riley's mind, off. It wasn't the suit or the calm demeanor, it was something else. Perhaps the way Jason stood out, not blending into the frantic energy of the terminal. Or maybe, deep down, Riley's instincts were clouded by subconscious bias, though he'd never admit it. Jason approached the security checkpoint, handing over his ID and boarding pass. The TSA officer glanced at his documents, nodded, and motioned him forward. But Riley, watching from a distance, stepped closer. "Excuse me, sir," Riley said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. Jason paused, looking up at the officer with a mix of surprise and calm politeness. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jason asked, his voice measured, almost too calm for the situation. Riley's eyes narrowed. "Routine check. Mind stepping aside for a moment?" Jason hesitated, glancing at his boarding pass and then back at Riley. Around them, travelers slowed their pace, some pretending not to notice, others blatantly staring. A few began pulling out their phones. Jason sighed but nodded, stepping to the side as instructed. Riley gestured toward a less crowded area near the terminal wall, his hand hovering near his belt, not threatening, but enough to send a subtle signal of authority. As Riley began asking questions, the tension in the air thickened. "Where are you headed today?" "Los Angeles," Jason replied, his tone unwavering. "What's the purpose of your trip?" Riley pressed, his eyes scanning Jason from head to toe. Jason hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something crossing his face, annoyance, perhaps, or the weight of familiarity with moments like these. "Business," he said simply. Riley tilted his head, his suspicion growing. "And what kind of business are you in?" Jason met his gaze, holding it for a moment longer than most would. "Aviation." The answer only seemed to deepen Riley's doubt. He crossed his arms, looking at Jason as though expecting more. "Aviation? What exactly do you do in aviation?" Jason's lips curled into a faint smile, not one of amusement, but of restraint. "I'll let you figure that out." The ambiguous response didn't sit well with Riley. He decided to escalate, calling for backup. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as two more officers approached. Jason stood still, his calmness contrasting with the growing tension around him. "Is this necessary?" Jason asked, his voice steady but tinged with irritation. "That depends," Riley shot back. "Why don't you tell us what you're hiding?" At this, Jason chuckled softly, shaking his head. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. The officers tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their holsters. Jason stopped, raising his hand slightly. "Relax," he said, pulling out a sleek, black ID card. He handed it to Riley, who took it with a skeptical glance. As Riley read the card, the color drained from his face. The badge wasn't just any identification, it was a card reserved for senior executives of one of the largest airlines in the world. And not just any executive. Jason King wasn't an employee or even a high-ranking officer. He was the owner. Riley's hands shook slightly as he handed the card back. He opened his mouth to speak but seemed unable to form words. Behind him, one of the backup officers glanced at the ID and let out a low whistle. Jason watched Riley with a calm, almost pitying expression. "Now," Jason said, his voice low but commanding, "do you still have questions, or are we done here?" The scene had drawn an even larger crowd by now, phones capturing every moment. Some murmured in disbelief as the truth sank in. The man they'd seen being interrogated wasn't just any traveler, he owned the very airline most of them were likely flying on. Jason looked around, his gaze settling briefly on each officer. "Next time," he said evenly, "try asking questions before assuming." Without waiting for a response, he adjusted his suit jacket, picked up his carry-on, and walked toward his gate. Behind him, Riley stood frozen, the weight of his actions sinking in. It was only the beginning of a story that would ripple. Jason King wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, but his journey to that fateful moment in the airport was far from ordinary. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Jason learned early on that success wasn't something handed to you, it had to be earned, often against overwhelming odds. His parents, both teachers, instilled in him a love for learning and a determination to rise above societal expectations. As a young boy, Jason had been captivated by airplanes. He would spend hours watching them soar overhead, imagining the lives of the people on board and dreaming of traveling the world. But the dream of flying wasn't enough for Jason, he wanted to understand what made planes fly, what kept them in the air, and who decided where they went. That curiosity propelled him into a world where people like him were often excluded. Jason worked tirelessly through school, excelling in math and science, despite being told by some teachers that aviation wasn't a field for kids like him. He took every scholarship opportunity he could find and eventually earned a degree in aerospace engineering. But even then, the journey wasn't easy. His first job out of college was with a major airline, but not in the prestigious engineering department he had hoped for. Instead, he worked as a baggage handler, using the job to study the company's operations from the ground up. Years of perseverance and a refusal to accept limitations led Jason to break barriers, moving from the tarmac to the boardroom. By his late 30s, he had built a reputation as a visionary in the industry, known for his innovative ideas and sharp business acumen. When a struggling regional airline was on the verge of collapse, Jason took a bold risk, investing his savings and securing loans to purchase it. Under his leadership, the airline not only recovered but expanded, becoming a global powerhouse. Despite his achievements, Jason never forgot where he came from. He kept his interactions with his employees personal, often visiting the tarmac or sitting in economy class to get a first-hand perspective of the travel experience. He knew that respect wasn't just about titles or wealth, it was about how you treated people, no matter their role. Officer Mark Riley's story was a stark contrast. Riley grew up in a working-class family in the same city, but his experiences were shaped by a different set of challenges. His father, a retired cop, instilled in him a sense of duty and pride in serving the community. Riley joined the police force straight out of high school, driven by a desire to protect and uphold the law. Over the years, he developed a tough exterior, shaped by the pressures of his job and a series of personal setbacks, including a difficult divorce that left him feeling bitter and isolated. Riley prided himself on being vigilant, but his perspective was narrow. He often relied on gut instincts, which, while occasionally accurate, were also influenced by biases he didn't fully recognize. To Riley, Jason King wasn't a man in a suit, he was an unknown element in a space where familiarity often equated to safety. That morning at the airport, Riley wasn't thinking about Jason's background or achievements. He saw a man who didn't seem to fit the mold of the typical first-class traveler. The expensive suit, the calm demeanor, the air of authority, it all felt too much to Riley, triggering a suspicion he couldn't quite articulate. The tension between their worlds was palpable. Jason's calm confidence was not arrogance but the hard-won result of years spent proving himself in spaces where he was often the only black man in the room. Riley's demeanor, on the other hand, was the result of years of operating in an environment where split-second decisions could mean life or death, but where biases often went unchallenged. As the backup officers arrived, the contrast between Jason's composed exterior and Riley's increasingly defensive stance became more evident. Jason had seen this scenario play out before, different faces, different places, but the same underlying assumptions. He was no stranger to being second-guessed, to having to justify his presence in spaces where others moved freely without question. Riley, however, was unprepared for the turn the situation would take. As the reality of Jason's identity began to sink in, the officer's confidence wavered. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a moment that could upend everything Riley thought he knew about his job, his instincts, and the biases he refused to acknowledge. The crowd that had gathered was no longer just curious, they were captivated, their murmurs a mix of disbelief and indignation. Jason's calm but firm handling of the situation was a masterclass in grace under pressure. As he walked away, the tension he left behind was electric, a lingering charge that would ripple far beyond the confines of that terminal. For Riley, the encounter was more than a professional embarrassment, it was a personal reckoning. For Jason, it was yet another reminder of the hurdles he faced, even at the pinnacle of success. And for the onlookers, it was a moment that forced them to question their own assumptions about power, privilege, and the unseen battles people fight every day. The incident would soon become the talk of the town, a story shared and reshared, dissected in articles and social media posts. But for those directly involved, it was the beginning of a deeper journey, one that would challenge them to confront uncomfortable truths and redefine what it meant to truly see and respect another person. As Jason walked away from the confrontation, he could feel the weight of 100 eyes on his back, each pair carrying a mix of emotions: curiosity, embarrassment, admiration, and in some cases, shame. For most, this was a spectacle, a brief break from the monotony of their travel routines. For Jason, however, it was a reminder of a story he had lived too many times. He adjusted his suit jacket, keeping his head high, though a flicker of frustration passed across his face. Behind him, Officer Riley remained frozen, clutching Jason's ID in one hand as if the truth it revealed had physically struck him. His fellow officers exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to console him, chastise him, or just quietly back away. The crowd lingered, phones still held aloft, capturing the aftermath of an incident that was quickly spiraling beyond Riley's control. Jason reached Gate 12, where the flight attendants, who had just learned who he was, greeted him with a mix of nervous smiles and deference. Jason offered them a polite nod before taking a seat in the VIP lounge. As he sat down, the adrenaline of the moment began to dissipate, replaced by a simmering frustration he kept carefully contained. He wasn't angry in the way people might expect, he was disappointed that even after all his achievements, all his hard work, he still had to justify himself in moments like these. Meanwhile, Riley retreated to a back office near the security checkpoint, his thoughts a whirlwind. His commanding officer, a seasoned but empathetic woman named Lieutenant Grace Mallory, had been called in after Jason's phone call. Grace wasn't one for dramatic displays, but her tone carried the weight of authority when she spoke. "Riley, we need to talk," she said, her arms crossed. Riley nodded, still clutching Jason's ID as if it were evidence of a crime, though now the only crime seemed to be his own misjudgment. "I thought..." he started, but Grace cut him off with a sharp glance. "You thought what?" "That a black man in a suit must be up to no good," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Riley's jaw tightened, his instincts to defend himself warring with a growing sense of guilt. He was acting off. Too calm. It didn't sit right. Grace sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Mark, do you know who that man is?" She didn't wait for him to answer. "That's Jason King." The CEO and owner of Skynova Airlines. He's the reason half the people in this terminal have a flight to board today. Riley felt his stomach drop. The name Jason King was familiar, though he hadn't connected it in the moment. He'd seen news articles about the airline's meteoric rise under its dynamic young owner, stories about Jason's innovative approach to business and his commitment to inclusivity in an industry that had long been criticized for its lack of diversity. And now, Riley had just publicly humiliated the man in front of an audience of travelers. Grace stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Mark, this isn't just about embarrassing yourself or the department. This is about the bigger picture. What you did out there wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of something we all need to reckon with. You made an assumption, and you acted on it without thinking." Riley's defenses finally crumbled under her words. He nodded slowly, his face pale. "I didn't mean for it to escalate like that," he muttered. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "Intent doesn't erase impact. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Back in the terminal, word of the incident had spread quickly. Travelers whispered to one another, some watching the viral videos that were already circulating online. Jason's calm demeanor and Riley's flustered reaction had been captured from multiple angles, each clip fueling debates about power, privilege, and the assumptions people make based on appearances. Jason's phone buzzed with a flurry of messages, colleagues, friends, and even strangers offering support. Among them was a message from his public relations team, asking if he wanted to issue a statement. Jason stared at the message for a long moment, then placed the phone down. He wasn't ready to make this a public spectacle, not yet. Meanwhile, a small group of airport staff had gathered to discuss the fallout. A baggage handler named Carlos, who had worked for Skynova for years, spoke up. "I've met Mr. King a couple of times. He's the real deal. Doesn't act like he's better than anyone else. And that cop? He treated him like some kind of criminal." A ticket agent named Sarah nodded. "I get why people are upset, but it's more than just about Mr. King. This happens all the time, to people who don't have the power or the name to fight back." Their words reflected a growing sentiment among the airport's employees and passengers alike. For many, the incident was a wake-up call, a moment that forced them to confront the biases and inequalities that often went unnoticed in their daily lives. As the minutes turned into hours, Riley couldn't shake the weight of the encounter. He replayed the moment in his head, searching for signs that he had misjudged Jason. The truth was clear now. He hadn't seen a man in a suit or a successful businessman. He'd seen a stereotype, one he'd unconsciously carried for years. Determined to make amends, Riley requested a meeting with Jason before he boarded his flight. Grace hesitated but ultimately agreed, seeing it as an opportunity for both men to address the incident head-on. When Riley entered the VIP lounge, Jason was seated by the window, gazing out at the runway where planes taxied to and from the gates. He didn't look up as Riley approached, but his posture stiffened slightly. Riley cleared his throat. "Mr. King," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "I want to apologize." Jason turned, his expression unreadable. He gestured for Riley to sit across from him. "Go on," he said, his tone even. Riley hesitated, then spoke. "I misjudged you. I made assumptions that had no basis in fact, and I acted on them without considering the consequences. I know an apology doesn't erase what happened, but I want you to know I'm sorry." Jason studied him for a long moment, his gaze piercing but not unkind. "Do you know why this keeps happening, Officer Riley?" he asked finally. Riley shook his head, his face clouded with regret. "It's because people like you, people in positions of authority, are too quick to act on fear instead of understanding," Jason continued. "I've worked my whole life to get where I am, and yet, moments like today remind me that to some, I'll always be just another black man in a suit." Riley looked down, unable to meet Jason's eyes. "You're right," he admitted. I have a lot to learn. And I want to do better. Jason leaned back, his expression softening. Then start by listening. By questioning your assumptions. And by treating everyone with the same respect you'd want for yourself. The conversation ended with a handshake, one that carried the weight of unspoken truths and a tentative hope for change. As Riley left the lounge, Jason turned back to the window, watching as another plane took to the skies. He knew this incident would follow him, but he also knew it was an opportunity to challenge perceptions, to inspire dialogue, and perhaps, to create a world where moments like these became a thing of the past. The days following the incident at the airport turned Jason King's life into a whirlwind of media attention and public discourse. What had initially been a private moment of indignity had now become a global conversation about systemic bias and racial profiling. Jason, a man who preferred to stay out of the spotlight unless it directly pertained to his work, found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't sought but couldn't avoid. The video of Officer Riley's confrontation had gone viral, with millions of views in a matter of days. It wasn't just about the man detained, it was about what he represented. Social media was ablaze with opinions, hashtags trending worldwide. Some users expressed outrage over the blatant profiling and lauded Jason for his composure. Others deflected the conversation, attempting to frame the incident as a misunderstanding rather than a symptom of something much deeper. Major news outlets picked up the story, inviting experts to discuss race, authority, and implicit bias. Jason's name, previously celebrated in the business world, now appeared in headlines for reasons he had never anticipated. Jason, however, was deliberate in his response. He issued a short, carefully worded statement that acknowledged the incident without sensationalizing it. The events at the airport were unfortunate, but they reflect broader issues we need to address as a society. My focus remains on fostering understanding and driving positive change, both within my industry and beyond. The statement struck a chord, resonating with those who saw in Jason not just a victim but a leader capable of turning adversity into opportunity. But the attention came with challenges. Calls flooded into Skynova Airlines from passengers, activists, and even competitors. Jason's team scrambled to manage the sudden influx of media requests and public inquiries. Investors grew nervous, fearing the controversy might overshadow the company's achievements. Jason spent hours in meetings, reassuring his board and strategizing ways to turn the incident into a catalyst for meaningful change. Meanwhile, Officer Riley faced a very different fallout. The video had sparked an internal investigation by the airport authority, as well as widespread criticism from the public. Riley, once seen by his peers as a reliable if rigid officer, now found himself under scrutiny. His actions were dissected in training sessions, news segments, and online debates. Some of his colleagues distanced themselves, worried their association with him might tarnish their own reputations. Riley himself was grappling with the weight of what he had done. He couldn't escape the comments, the articles, or the endless replays of his encounter with Jason. He had spent years building a career he was proud of, but now, in a single moment, he had become a symbol of everything he had once vowed to fight against. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Determined to make amends, Riley sought guidance from Lieutenant Grace Mallory, whose steady hand had been his anchor in the storm. Grace, recognizing his genuine remorse, suggested he attend community workshops on implicit bias and racial sensitivity. Riley, though initially resistant, agreed. The workshops were eye-opening, forcing him to confront his own blind spots and the systemic issues that allowed them to thrive. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Riley sat in his car, staring at the flyer for the next workshop. It was titled, "Understanding the Stories Behind the Faces, Recognizing Humanity in Every Encounter." He thought about Jason, about the calm dignity with which he had handled the confrontation, and about how much he had misjudged him. Riley decided he needed to go further. He reached out to Jason through the airport's administrative office, requesting another meeting. Jason, busy as ever, was initially hesitant. But after some deliberation, he agreed, seeing an opportunity to continue the conversation that had started in the airport lounge. When Riley arrived at Skynova's headquarters, he was struck by the sleek, modern design of the building. The walls were adorned with photos of planes, employees, and destinations from around the world, a testament to the company's global reach and the lives it touched. A receptionist escorted Riley to Jason's office, where he was greeted not with hostility, but with a quiet professionalism that only deepened his respect for the man he had wronged. Jason sat behind a large desk, his demeanor as calm as it had been in the terminal. He gestured for Riley to take a seat. "Officer Riley," he said, his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" Riley cleared his throat, suddenly feeling small in the presence of a man whose accomplishments far outweighed his own. "Mr. King, I wanted to thank you for agreeing to see me again. I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day at the airport, and I realized I can't just apologize and move on. I need to understand the impact of my actions and do better moving forward." Jason leaned back, studying Riley carefully. "And what have you learned so far?" Riley took a deep breath. "I've learned that my instincts, the ones I've relied on for years, aren't always right. They're shaped by biases I didn't even realize I had. I acted out of fear, not facts, and that's not what I became an officer to do. I've also learned that people like me need to take responsibility, not just for our actions, but for the systems that perpetuate these issues." Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a start," he said. "But understanding isn't enough. It has to lead to action. What do you plan to do with what you've learned?" Riley hesitated, then spoke with conviction. "I want to use my platform to help change the way officers are trained. I want to share my story, my mistakes, so others can learn from them. And I want to work with people like you to build bridges between communities and law enforcement." Jason's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's ambitious," he said. "But ambition is good. It's what got me where I am today." The two men spent the next hour discussing their respective journeys, their challenges, and their hopes for the future. By the time Riley left, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to turn his mistake into a catalyst for growth, not just for himself but for others as well. For Jason, the meeting was a reminder of why he had agreed to speak out in the first place. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but if even one person could change their perspective because of his story, it would be worth it. And in the weeks and months that followed, Jason and Riley's paths would cross again, not as adversaries, but as allies in a shared mission to create a more just and equitable world. As the weeks turned into months, the ripples from the airport incident grew into waves of change, both personal and public. Jason King had always believed in leveraging moments of adversity into opportunities, and this time was no different. Though the experience had been humiliating, it became a catalyst for a broader mission he hadn't anticipated. Skynova Airlines, already celebrated for its progressive policies, began championing a new initiative, Elevating Awareness, a campaign aimed at fostering conversations about unconscious bias and equality across industries. The campaign launched with a bold move. Skynova partnered with civil rights organizations and diversity consultants to create workshops and programs for its own employees. The first wave focused on frontline staff, from flight attendants to gate agents, but it soon expanded to include everyone in the company. Jason's goal was clear: to create an environment where no one, regardless of their background, ever felt lesser or judged. He also ensured that Skynova's partnerships extended to law enforcement agencies, offering training on implicit bias and respectful engagement at airports where the airline operated. The campaign garnered significant media attention, with Jason appearing on major networks to discuss its goals. In one particularly poignant interview, he addressed the incident directly. "What happened at the airport wasn't just about me," he said. "It was a mirror reflecting the biases many of us carry, often without realizing it. My hope is that by having these conversations, we can dismantle those biases piece by piece." His words resonated deeply, sparking widespread discussions and inspiring other businesses to follow Skynova's lead. Meanwhile, Officer Riley was undergoing his own transformation. The workshops he attended were just the beginning. He enrolled in a certification program focused on community policing and began volunteering with local organizations dedicated to bridging gaps between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Riley also joined a mentorship program where he shared his story with younger officers, emphasizing the importance of empathy and accountability in their work. But Riley knew his efforts needed to reach beyond police precincts and training rooms. With Jason's permission, he began speaking publicly about the airport incident, framing it as a turning point in his life. At first, he was met with skepticism, particularly from those who questioned his sincerity. But over time, his humility and commitment to change began to win people over. He became a regular speaker at Skynova's Elevating Awareness workshops, where his first-hand account of the incident offered a unique perspective on how bias operates in real time. One of the most pivotal moments in Riley's journey came when he was invited to a community forum hosted by Jason and Skynova. The event, held in a sprawling auditorium, brought together leaders from various sectors, business, law enforcement, education, and advocacy, to discuss actionable steps toward equity and inclusion. Riley was nervous as he stepped onto the stage, knowing the audience included people who had likely judged him harshly after the viral video. He began his speech with a simple admission: "I failed." The room fell silent as Riley recounted the day at the airport, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But more than that, I realized how often these moments go unnoticed, unrecorded, and unaddressed. That's why I'm here, not to erase what I did, but to make sure it doesn't happen again, to anyone." Jason, who spoke after Riley, commended his courage. "Owning our mistakes is never easy," he said, addressing the audience. "But it's a necessary step toward growth. What matters is not just recognizing the problem but committing to being part of the solution." The forum was a resounding success, with attendees praising its candid and solution-focused approach. The event was live-streamed, and clips of Jason and Riley's speeches quickly spread online, reigniting the viral conversation in a more constructive direction. For many viewers, seeing the two men collaborate, one the victim of bias, the other its perpetrator, was a powerful symbol of reconciliation and progress. Beyond the public eye, Jason and Riley's partnership deepened. They began working on a joint project to develop a standardized training program for law enforcement officers stationed at airports, emphasizing cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. The program, which combined Jason's business acumen with Riley's on-the-ground experience, quickly gained traction, with several airports adopting it as part of their regular training regimen. Despite their progress, the journey was not without challenges. Both men faced backlash, Jason from critics who accused him of exploiting the incident for publicity, and Riley from colleagues who resented his newfound activism. But they refused to let the negativity deter them. "Change is messy," Jason often said. "If everyone's comfortable, you're probably not doing enough." As time passed, the incident at the airport became less of a headline and more of a case study, a story people referenced in discussions about equity, accountability, and the power of dialogue. Jason's Elevating Awareness campaign grew into a broader movement, with other companies adopting similar initiatives. Riley, once defined by a single moment of poor judgment, became a respected advocate for reform within law enforcement circles. Their efforts culminated in a historic event 2 years later. The signing of the Airport Equity and Accountability Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation aimed at standardizing anti-bias training and accountability measures for airport personnel nationwide. Jason and Riley were both present at the ceremony, their unlikely partnership a testament to the power of second chances and shared purpose. As they stood side by side, watching the bill become law, Jason turned to Riley with a faint smile. "Never thought we'd end up here," he said. Riley chuckled, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Neither did I. But I'm glad we did. Their handshake, captured by photographers, became an iconic image, two men from vastly different worlds united by a shared commitment to building a better one. For Jason, the moment was a reminder that even the most painful experiences could lead to growth and progress. For Riley, it was proof that redemption wasn't just possible, it was transformative. And for everyone watching, it was a powerful reminder that change, no matter how daunting, always begins with a single step forward. As the final chapter of their intertwined journey unfolded, Jason King and Officer Riley found themselves navigating a transformed landscape. The ripple effects of their collaboration had reached places neither could have anticipated. Skynova Airline's Elevating Awareness campaign had become a blueprint for companies worldwide, and the airport incident had evolved from a viral sensation to a textbook example of accountability and growth. Yet, the work was far from over, and both men knew it. They had planted seeds, but nurturing them into lasting change required persistence, courage, and a shared commitment to the long haul. Jason's role as a public advocate for equity had grown beyond the aviation industry. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences, universities, and corporate gatherings. Jason, ever the visionary, approached these opportunities with a balance of optimism and pragmatism. The goal, he often told audiences, isn't perfection. It's progress. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. And every step, no matter how small, matters. One of Jason's most ambitious undertakings was the establishment of the King Equity Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to dismantling systemic barriers and promoting diversity across industries. The foundation's programs ranged from scholarships for underrepresented students in STEM fields to grants for grassroots organizations fighting discrimination. Jason made a point of including beneficiaries in the decision-making process, ensuring the foundation's initiatives were both impactful and deeply rooted in the communities they served. Meanwhile, Riley's transformation had reached a new phase. Bolstered by his growing reputation as a reform advocate, he took on a leadership role within his precinct, heading a task force focused on community engagement and ethical policing. His journey from an officer who perpetuated bias to one actively working to dismantle it was both inspiring and sobering for those around him. Riley's approach was grounded in transparency. He encouraged open dialogue, invited community members to training sessions, and even participated in ride-alongs with activists to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. One of Riley's most significant achievements was the creation of the Trust in Action program, a partnership between law enforcement agencies, local businesses, and civil rights groups. The program's centerpiece was a series of simulations that placed officers in scenarios designed to test their ability to recognize and overcome biases. Riley personally oversaw the development of these simulations, drawing from his own experiences to ensure their authenticity and effectiveness. The program gained national recognition, with departments across the country adopting it as part of their training curricula. Despite their separate paths, Jason and Riley remained close collaborators. They met regularly to exchange ideas and reflect on their progress. These meetings, often held over coffee or in quiet conference rooms, were a mix of strategy sessions and heartfelt conversations. Both men valued the bond they had forged, a bond rooted in accountability, growth, and a shared belief in the power of second chances. One of their most poignant collaborations was a joint memoir, Breaking the Barrier, a story of bias, redemption, and change. Written in alternating voices, the book chronicled their journeys before, during, and after the airport incident. It delved into Jason's rise as a business leader, Riley's early years in law enforcement, and the pivotal moment that brought their worlds together. The book was both a personal reflection and a call to action, urging readers to confront their own biases and strive for a more inclusive society. Upon its release, Breaking the Barrier became a bestseller, sparking book clubs, panel discussions, and social media campaigns centered around its themes. The impact of their story extended beyond the professional realm. Riley, once estranged from his family due to the shame and fallout of the incident, found a renewed connection with them. His journey toward redemption had inspired his teenage son, who had previously struggled to see his father as a role model. Together, they began volunteering at community events, forging a bond that had once seemed out of reach. For Jason, the journey deepened his relationship with his own family, particularly his niece, who had been a vocal supporter of his advocacy work. Their shared passion for equity became a source of inspiration for both. As the years passed, Jason and Riley's story continued to evolve. The programs and initiatives they had launched flourished, inspiring similar efforts worldwide. The Airport Equity and Accountability Act, once a groundbreaking piece of legislation, became a cornerstone of airport operations, setting a standard for industries beyond aviation. Yet, both men remained acutely aware that their work was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Their final collaboration, a documentary titled The Long Road to Change, captured the essence of their journey. The film, directed by an acclaimed filmmaker, wove together interviews, archival footage, and candid moments between Jason and Riley. It premiered at a major film festival to critical acclaim, with audiences praising its unflinching honesty and hopeful message. In one particularly moving scene, Riley revisited the airport where the incident had occurred, reflecting on how much had changed, not just in the policies and training but within himself. The documentary's closing scene featured Jason and Riley standing on a stage, addressing a packed auditorium. Jason's voice carried the steady conviction of a man who had seen the worst and still believed in the best. This journey wasn't about redemption for one person or progress for one company. It was about proving that change is possible when we face our flaws with honesty and courage. Riley, standing beside him, added, "It's easy to look at the world and feel overwhelmed by how much needs to be fixed. But every step forward matters. Every conversation, every act of accountability, brings us closer to the world we want to see." As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Jason and Riley exchanged a look, one of shared gratitude and determination. Their journey had started with a moment of conflict, but it had become a testament to the transformative power of understanding, resilience, and partnership. For years to come, their story would be a beacon for those seeking change, a reminder that even the most unlikely alliances could create a brighter, more equitable future. And for Jason King and Riley, the journey was far from over. It was a legacy they would continue to build, one step at a time.